Welcome to the Third Sector podcast, brought to you by the Third Sector editorial team. In this episode, we'll be examining the recent demise of Manchester Pride and asking what it has to say about charity events and ventures that are heavily reliant on the corporate partnerships bandwagon. We'll interrogate different verdicts on the present state of volunteering. And we'll hear what the Chief Executive of the RNLI has to say about how the charity is working to maintain its relevance and its reputation in the years to come. I'm your host, Lucinda Rouse, and I'm joined by Emily Harle.
Hello.
Dami Adewale.
Good morning.
And Emily Burt.
Hello.
This is our monthly in-house episode. It takes the form of an editorial team meeting in which we consider a few recent stories we've been covering that have raised some interesting points. We recorded our first one last month on Emily Burt's second day back from maternity leave. Emily, we spared you from jumping straight in at the deep end on that one.
Thank you so much.
But delighted to have you with us this time. And we are going to need to acclimatise ourselves to the fact that we now have two Emilys in the room. You don't look dissimilar with your fringes and glasses.
First we've heard about it. Yeah, I know.
But you sound quite different. So, Emily Burt, back in the hot seat after 10 months. Do you have any observations to share on how you found the sector coming back to it after quite a lengthy stint out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this time when I was on maternity leave, I divorced myself so completely from everything that was happening in the charity sector. I went very much into a little cocoon. And now, having been back in post for a month, the thing that is really jumping out to me right now is that reminder, I think, that small charities are always the bellwether for big structural problems in our sector. Because when I went away at the end of last year to go on mat leave, we'd had several months of covering this very painful cycle of stories which all revolved around small, local grassroots organisations, hospices, children's activity centres, retreats, going under, laying people off, financially having to restructure because they could not cope with the financial situation that they were all facing. And that message of things are no longer financially viable for us, everything is financially unsustainable, was this very, very big refrain. Now, 10 months down the line, I'm back and I am being so struck by the sheer volume of the big household names who are now experiencing a lot of pain. We've seen the National Trust, we've seen the NSPCC, we've seen the RSPCA, Oxfam GB, just to name a few of those household names, who are now undergoing restructures, are having to go through redundancy programs, and who are now giving these same messages that actually we cannot carry on under the burden of these continually rising costs. I think there's some real anxiety about the autumn budget, which is coming in a month's time. Emily covered some research from Rathbones at the beginning of this week, which found that 7 in 10 charity leaders think that the autumn budget is going to negatively impact their finances. We already know that they're on shaky ground in this space. And I feel very conscious of a real exhaustion, actually, among the leaders that I've spoken to since my return. And I find that quite troubling because I wonder where people are getting their respite in this very tough time. So I'm sorry that I'm not giving something lighter, but that is just what I've seen since coming back. And I do know, having worked on third sector for half a decade, that charities do prevail. They always do. This is a sector that is built to weather storms, but right now it does definitely feel like there is a bit of a gale going on.
Absolutely. Perhaps one potential tiny silver lining about the fact that this has graduated from the smaller organisations to the big names is that the plight that the sector is in might get more widespread attention. Obviously, we've been reporting it, but I think initially there was a sense that these are all really small organisations that are going under. We picked up as many as we could, and there was a time where it was like on a weekly basis we were reporting multiple small charity closures. But the fact that now the NSPCC, the RSPCA, the National Trust are all making hundreds of staff redundant, perhaps means that people more broadly in society, in the political sphere, are going to sit up and take note and actually think about what the implication of this is going to be. Whether there's a solution, I don't know.
And obviously, we should cast an eye on the government and keep an eye on the civil society covenant, considering the autumn budget is coming up as well, as you mentioned, Emily. So it's going to be interesting to see how the government relates and continues its relationship with the sector, just to see what they're thinking about and how they can help in that instance.
Yeah. And the extent to which they acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of those trusted large organisations which often fall in the public eye and are very good at capturing headlines and raising awareness, Lucinda, you travelled last week. You've been back down to Poole to visit the RNLI once again and to meet their new chief executive. I would love to hear about, how was your conversation with him?
It was very interesting. So yes, it was my second trip to Poole in the space of about 16 months. Last time I met the outgoing chief executive, Mark Dowie, just a couple of weeks before he entered his retirement, which he said was going to consist of working in his local RNLI shop. I was very pleased to be invited back to meet his successor, Peter Sparks, and we're going to play a few clips from my interview with him. My invitation coincided with the release earlier this month of a new 5-year plan for the RNLI, which very much acknowledges the changing world in which they are operating and lays out ways in which they are going to bolster their resilience and continue with their mission of saving lives at sea in this new environment. I started my visit at their Riggers restaurant. I had a quick lunch before the interview started, and it was absolutely booming with big groups of the older generation of Poole enjoying Guinness and white wine spritzers of a Thursday lunchtime. It was all very civilised. And a big part of this new 5-year plan focuses on how the RNLI is engaging with communities. They certainly seem to be getting it right in Poole, from what I could see from the Riggers restaurant. But here's what Peter had to say about the broader plan to retain the RNLI's relevance in the eyes of the public.
People's awareness of the RNLI is high at the moment. We can't take that for granted. We're going to need to maintain our relevance and interaction with people. One of the key things for me, and an insight that was learned by our fundraising team, was that 62% of people under the age of 40 now associate the RNLI with lifeguards rather than lifeboats, which is an even more profound shift for us as an organisation. That's what we've been synonymous for many years. And so in the future, we will, I sense, need to think more carefully about how we interact with people on the beach. In commercial terms, you might consider that to be where your customers are.
So sort of face-to-face fundraising.
So face-to-face fundraising and contactless payment on the beach perhaps, but also thinking how apps might help us, how we might enjoin people to help us to help them to keep their families safe on the beach that day.
I think that's really interesting, considering the age profile that he's looking at in terms of the people that they want to interact with. When I was a reporter in Essex, I used to cover places like Harwich, Southend, Clacton, and they had a big supporter base, the RNLI over there. So it was interesting just to think about the supporter base consisted of a lot of older people there. So it's interesting to see like their shift in mentality from working with older people who don't necessarily utilize technology the most, with kind of like shifting to people that are using apps and things like that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, very much so. And as a way of keeping the charity sustainable, I mean, we talked about fundraising, and we will hear what Peter has to say about rising costs and how they are protecting themselves against that and ensuring that their fundraising levels remain healthy. But over 60% of their income comes from legacies, which is obviously due to their relevance to the older generation, but very reassuring to know that they are thinking about digital, that thinking about new ways of interacting with supporters, both for fundraising, but also as a way of furthering their mission and engaging with people to improve water safety and knowledge around water safety. We obviously can't forget as well that their social media is first class. Their TikTok, their other ways of engaging with younger people is fantastic. But
absolutely, I'm obsessed with RNLI socials. I think there's an interesting point there about legacies, because that's a balance and a tension that charities with a big reliance on legacies always need to manage. Is you're not working to engage younger generations when you're looking at legacies, you're looking to engage that sort of slightly older group. But you're also needing to future-proof yourself. And I think, as Peter said, leaning into that sort of digital space can really help RNLI do that. And so I think there's sort of a tension to manage there.
The RNLI is a very distinct charity beast. It certainly felt different talking to Peter, hearing about some of his considerations. I don't think any other charity chief executive has 3 lifeboat factories under their watch. But unsurprisingly, the charity is still very much affected by the financial challenges that are faced by all charities and across the sector. And I'm going to play another clip here in which we discuss that. And I did feel that Peter was picking his words quite carefully.
I think we would all recognise that cost pressures are increasing across society and in the charitable sector. We are not immune to that. We have increases in the costs of lifeboat fuel, maintenance, support, pay and pensions, as every other organisation does. The key for me and my executive team colleagues and our trustees is to ensure that we are sustainable for the future.
Has the national insurance increase hit you badly?
I think, like most organisations, it wasn't an assumption, and we've had to make adjustments to make sure that we've been able to comply with that. But we have managed to reconcile that in year. So yes, we're okay at the moment.
Is fundraising keeping up with costs at the moment?
Broadly, just. I think it's worth recognising that the RNLI costs about £265 million a year to run. Now that's an extraordinary amount of money to raise, but also hugely impressive when you think that that is all from the generosity of the public. None of that is from taxpayers' money. That vital emergency service that we all rely upon is funded by the generosity of the public. That's quite incredible to me still.
And therefore highly susceptible to the effects of cost of living pressures on the public. Now, volunteering is a big topic for the RNLI, and I think in terms of the changes that we're likely to see in the coming years under Peter's leadership, volunteering is going to be quite high up there. He was keen to stress that it's a big priority for him to make sure that the volunteering offer of the RNLI is suitably flexible to fit in with people's lives in a way that it perhaps hasn't needed to do so much in the past. He acknowledged that this was quite a commercial term, but said that they're trying to cultivate a more customer-centric approach in how they recruit and retain their volunteers in order to meet both the needs of the volunteers and those of the organisation. It's going to cost a lot of money for the charity to be training their volunteers. So therefore, it's very important that they keep them and that there isn't a high turnover. And actually, sadly, one station since my last visit last year has closed. So they now have 237 lifeboat stations. It's Lievborough in the Isle of Harris closed because they just didn't have enough people to keep it running. So here's what Peter had to say about how they are approaching the tricky task of volunteering.
We are seeing a shift in the nature of volunteering, like most other organisations. And I can see a shift in the coming years to more micro-volunteering rather than blocks of days and weeks. We might have to think about how we can use digital services to make ourselves more agile and more dynamic in that regard.
How do you see that working?
Well, I think we might, whilst all crew would be declared, some might not be able to go whilst going for a doctor's appointment or something like that. But as soon as they're back from the doctor's appointment, they might be back on pager, or being more inclusive when somebody has to go and take a business meeting. They're not available there, and somebody else who is available will automatically slot into the team. And I've seen that done with our digital tools. We can enable that to maintain that coverage, to maintain a crew, but it's a different way of thinking rather than briefing in the morning and having your known crew, you know who's going to walk through the door of the lifeboat station. That's how we will probably need to work in the future, because we recognise our volunteers' time is really precious and it's given to us freely and willingly, and we need to prize that, we need to value it and really ensure that we are as frictionless as possible.
It's all in the name of flexibility,
yes,
isn't it? And
which is to the benefit of the volunteer and also the organisation.
It's interesting that you brought up being flexible and then using digital to remain agile and have that flexibility. We've seen quite a lot of digital solutions being pioneered within the charity sector over the last year. You've got RVS's Govo, which is intending to become the biggest volunteering platform that will host lots of different opportunities for people and provide that flexibility. So it's interesting to hear the chief executive of one of the big names really pioneering that digital agility within their volunteering, particularly one that is so reliant on volunteers.
I think also what's very interesting is this idea of flexibility and people not necessarily being able to give the time that they had done before. I'm not sure how a digital lifeguard would work. Perhaps I'm sure there are great interventions that people could use, apps to say whether the water is safe for swimming in on beaches or something like that off the top of my head. But I wonder if this is a reflection again on the broader economic environment, the fact that most households are not able to survive on single salaries at the moment. So people have to just be actually working more to keep on making ends meet and have less time to go and give a whole day a week to being on-call crew and go and save lives at sea.
Yes, and I think also the context in which many of these lifeboat stations are, as I mentioned, the station on the Isle of Harris sadly had to close in the past year. A lot of these coastal communities are depopulated, particularly by younger people, which means that, they're going off to other places in search of work because they just aren't the economic opportunities that they need at home to sustain themselves. So obviously that will have a knock-on effect of lifeboat crew simply not being there.
It's a really interesting paradox, isn't it? Because we do live with an aging population at the moment. So if you were in the top job at the RNLI, you'd be thinking, okay, on one hand, we have an aging population, not to be too morbid about it, great for our legacies. On the flip side of that, if we are going to start running down on young, able-bodied people, that then presents a completely different problem for a charity which has volunteers right at the very heart of everything that it does.
Now, if you'd like to know more about my conversation with Peter, there is a long read interview piece out on the Third Sector website. You can find it under the Features tab. And this final point about volunteering and how the RNLI is responding to a need for greater flexibility among its volunteers, that leads quite nicely on to your topic of the week, Dami.
Yeah, so I just wanted to have a chat with everyone about volunteering trends. Obviously, volunteering is always a hot topic of discussion in the sector. So many small charities rely exclusively on volunteers, meaning the amount of people lending their time can have like a serious effect on how charities operate. We've seen some interesting reports from the Centre for Better Aging, which found volunteer numbers for people over 50 have dropped by more than 1 million since 2019, which is obviously concerning. Also, figures from the Royal Voluntary Service show charities expect a shortfall of 3 million volunteers over the next year as well. But depending on who you speak to, the problem might not be as bad as initially thought. So Janet Thorne is the chief executive of Reach Volunteering, and in a podcast episode earlier this year, she told us that her charity has seen a 4-fold increase in people signing up to volunteer since the pandemic. In a subsequent opinion piece, she said thriving organizations usually fly under the radar because they don't show up in traditional volunteer networks and are not often registered charities. They're more community-based and led. So just thinking about that and the contrast between the two schools of thought, I just wanted to get everyone's opinions on what they think about the kind of landscape of volunteering and how the trends are kind of differing.
I think it's very interesting what you've just said there about the fact that people are volunteering and giving their time outside of that traditional charity model. I wonder if those sort of different organizations have more of that flexibility than you might expect from a more traditional model, whether you're, sticking stamps onto envelopes or working in a soup kitchen or something like that. So that was quite interesting. I'd be interested to know about the sort of opportunities organizations like that are offering. We had this real boom moment for volunteering during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we saw unprecedented levels of people coming out to give their time. And that really did feel like an inflection point. It was very much a sort of singular event that lasted for a year or two in 2020 and 2021. And it doesn't really surprise me that volunteering levels are in decline from that high point or failing to recover. I did read, though, that volunteering levels are struggling to recover even to pre-pandemic levels at the moment, which I do think that is interesting. I suspect, once again, it's that reflection on the economic conditions that we're living in at the moment.
I also wonder if that move to more community-led volunteering, that seems to have stemmed from the pandemic, where everyone was sort of pitching in and doing their bit and really pioneering that from within the communities. But also we're seeing people being more active by showing up to protest and exercising their right of freedom of speech and trying to sort of speak up and take active action on issues that matter to them, because it's a way that they can feel that they're making a difference. It's a way that they can feel less passive, like they're just letting life happen, and actually stand up for issues they care about, which could mean perhaps people are exerting their energy into that kind of active protest rather than exerting their energy into volunteering for those good causes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation. And I think much of what you said just now chimes in with what Janet Thorne was reporting. And I would really recommend that anyone interested in this topic goes back and listens to our interview with her earlier this year. I can include a link in the show notes to this episode. But at Reach Volunteering, they conducted a survey and they were looking to understand why people were signing up to volunteer for the causes that they were, and why they'd had this great explosion on their platform of interest in people wanting to volunteer. And so much of it was this sense of purpose and wanting to make a difference. But so many of the opportunities that are there on their platform are these small grassroots movements, in some cases organizations, which perhaps fly under the radar of the official figures of how many people are volunteering, and the forms of volunteering that they are undertaking are very different to the traditional sticking stamps on envelopes and that sort of thing. And Janet wrote a piece for us on the Third Sector website, and I'm just going to quote one sentence that she wrote, which I thought was very interesting, which is, too often investment in volunteering focuses on efficiency, reducing friction, and micro-volunteering as though convenience is the main motivator. So she's saying that's not the main motivator. It's purpose, it's agency, it's feeling like you are actively making a difference through the volunteering work that you're doing. Very interesting to then look at that from the perspective of the RNLI, where my interview with Peter, he talked very much about reducing friction, micro-volunteering, digital solutions to make the whole process more efficient. And yet that organisation has perhaps one of the simplest purposes in the charity sector, to save lives at sea. And he reiterated just how much every single person working for that organisation is driven by that purpose. But yet they are facing these issues of not having enough volunteers able to sign up for the number of hours that they want. And perhaps the form of intervention that they need from their volunteers is different to the slightly more activism, grassroots movements.
Yeah, and it's interesting how much the cause of a charity can kind of influence the type of volunteering that they can recruit as well, in terms of what Janet has said as well. She said that it's the participatory nature of volunteering that kind of influences whether their institutions can thrive in terms of volunteering. So she said with volunteers shaping their engagement, the work they do, and even the organization strategy, that's how volunteering recruitment can kind of improve in that sense. So obviously, in terms of the pandemic, people had like a singular kind of mentality in kind of improving society, keeping everyone safe. So I think it would be interesting to kind of think about how volunteering numbers change in terms of what type of cause they're supporting. So that's just another thought I had as well.
Absolutely. And I think, again, it's a really important point. The pandemic gave everyone purpose. Right? It comes back to that idea of like feeling like you're making an immediate difference on your doorstep and that you have a purpose. And it felt like everyone in that period had a common purpose, which was to try to get back to where we all wanted to be. And I think that was really the root of where that enormous collective spirit that we saw in 2020 and 21 came from. So that ties back to your mission. How do you communicate that? How do you make people feel like they are behaving in a way that is active, as Emily was saying, that is purposeful and that is driven? And I think if you make sure that's at the core of everything that you do, then you're far more likely to have success. But Dami, as you say, I would also be interested to see if there are certain cause areas at the moment which are proving more popular and that are garnering more active support than others.
So clearly a topic that is very much up for debate. I don't think we have solved the volunteering conundrum, nor were we expecting to. Let's move on. Emily, what's your story for this week?
So my story this week links quite nicely with what Emily observed upon her return to the sector about a rise in the amount of charities who are struggling and household names really struggling. So last week, Manchester Pride made the unfortunate announcement that it was going into liquidation, with a statement from its board which said that the charity was no longer financially viable. And this is obviously very unfortunate news, but the charity has been at the centre of a lot of speculation lately. So several performers and vendors have raised allegations in the media over the past week or so, saying that they had not been paid for their work at the Pride event, which actually took place back in August, so it's been months. Performers told BBC Newsbeat that they'd been waiting for their payments for months and that their complaints had gone unanswered by the charity. These concerns led to the Charity Commission actually opening a compliance case into the charity as well, which we at Third Sector reported on. The charity's radio silence was widely criticised on social media, but when its trustees finally announced that it was actually closing, they said that the radio silence was because they had hoped to find ways to continue the charity's work and they didn't want to jeopardise financial opportunities. They did apologise, the trustees did apologise for people who are going to lose out financially due to the situation, and said they've handed over the details of artists and suppliers who are still owed money to the charity's liquidators. So it's a very sad and sorry state of affairs, and as a queer person myself, it does not bring me any joy to be reporting on this at all. Manchester Pride is a very large Pride event. People travel from all over the country to attend, and it's also not the first Pride event to have faced challenges lately. So Liverpool Pride this year was almost cancelled after LCR Pride Foundation said it was facing financial and organisational challenges, but the event was luckily saved when a local charity, Sahir House, stepped in and created a big fundraising push. As far as Manchester Pride goes, the charity said that the closure came from a combination of rising costs, which has affected the entire events industry, and declining ticket sales. The charity also pointed to its unsuccessful bid to host Euro Pride and a recent refresh of its format, which aimed to tackle these challenges of declining ticket sales and rising costs. So it is a combination of factors that has led to this. But I wanted to bring this to the table because I think there's a conversation here around how charities can handle situations like this when they are facing imminent financial risk. There was a lot of scrutiny put on the charity because of the failure to pay performers and because of the silence that performers were met with. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what other charities can learn from this, not just charities that are facing financial risk, but what charities can learn about communicating those difficult decisions, particularly at a time when so many charities are having to restructure, reorganise.
I mean, it's the ultimate responsibility of the trustees to initiate wind-up proceedings before it reaches this point, isn't it? Mm. So unfortunate, but then given that they were trying to find ways of saving the charity and resolving the situation, it's perhaps understandable that they weren't communicating at every step of the way that they were in significant trouble.
The thing is as well, is that a financial situation like this, you can see it coming down the road. It won't have become apparent in August this year that this was a sudden problem which had beset the charity. I think from something I'd read, I'm fairly sure they were in a financial hole to the tune of £400,000 according to their last set of financial accounts. So before we were even going into this year, there was a deficit there. So that's one thing. I do, in part, understand the argument about hoping that you're going to get out of a situation and not wanting to cause upset by talking publicly about your financial situation. However, when you reach that sort of a point, I don't think silence is the answer. Transparency really matters. And whenever I talk to chief executives about having to make difficult decisions, they always say it's the best thing you can do is have those unpleasant conversations. Was it the best idea to run an enormous Pride festival this summer? Maybe not. But as we are seeing, there are large charities which are having to make very difficult restructure, redundancy choices at the moment. But there are then lots of models you can see about how these organisations are choosing to communicate this. As a comms piece, I would say there have been some major failings in this area.
I also think there's another question here about the role of the corporatisation of Pride. And I'd be really curious to know how much funding Manchester Pride received from corporations garnering spaces on the Pride Parade route. Pride started as a protest, but for a long time these events have been funded by major companies getting involved, getting their spaces on the parade route, as I said, and giving their money to support the cause. And at a time when LGBT rights are becoming increasingly polarised and a politicised issue, I wonder if it's becoming less fashionable for companies to publicly support LGBT charities and Pride events. For example, in April, Third Sector reported that Not a Phase, which is a charity that supports trans people in the UK, said that it had lost almost all of its corporate partnerships, which is really stark. They said that they'd seen global companies backpedaling their DEI efforts and that they'd had to diversify the charity's income streams massively. So the question I wanted to put to the team here is, what does that mean for other charities who are the sort of topic of the moment for corporates to support and be very vocal and public about? Because as we've seen, that can't last forever.
Absolutely. And depressing as it is, and it is highly depressing, LGBT rights are now becoming something that is up for discussion, that is polarised, that is become a political football. And over the summer, there was a survey of more than 85 Pride organisations in the UK. 85 different organisations had all seen a reduction in their corporate sponsorships or their partnerships, according to this questionnaire. So this is not just an isolated instance. I would say structurally, we are seeing a pulling back in this space. And I think there is a definite cooling off that we're seeing on the part of corporates around not wanting to be associated with so-called controversial topics. And it is deeply depressing to me on a personal level that LGBT rights are now falling into this pool. But you can apply it across a very wide spectrum of things like environmental issues. You can apply it across wanting to have associations, for example, with like big pharma and drugs, all part of this like contentious areas around corporates. Organizations are going to have to think about how they weather that if they have been very reliant on corporate funding in the past.
Obviously, the sector's been talking a lot about collaboration, so it would be interesting to see if these organizations can sort of pool their resources and help each other. There's been a lot of talk about mergers as well, so there are a lot of different options that they can kind of utilise to see if they can help each other.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if Manchester Pride gets picked up by another organisation.
We hope you enjoyed this episode with the Third Sector editorial team. We'll be back again with another one at the end of November. But next week, we'll have our usual guest format and we'll be considering what an optimal closeout looks like for the Olympic legacy funder Spirit of 2012. But for now, from Emily, Dami and me and all of us at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our producer is Nav Pal.